On this site, on the 24th of October in the year 1066, the armies of William of Normandy and Harold Godwinson fought for the English crown. William's victory over Harold marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England, and with it a sea change in English culture, laws and governance. And although William's victory in winning England at battle secured his right to rule, Saxon resistance against the Normans continued for another 5 years, before eventually being quelled in the year 1071. Following the death of Edward the Confessor on the 5th of January 1066, a meeting was convened to determine who should succeed him. The Witan chose Edward's half-brother, Harold Godwinson, whose sister had been married to the late king, and whose family held great power across England and had connections leading back to King Canute's North Sea Empire. However, Harold's right to rule as agreed by the Witan was strongly contested by two main rival claimants, King Harald Hardrada of Norway and Duke William of Normandy. King Harald Hardrada promoted his claim to England through a treaty made some 26 years earlier in 1038 by his father King Magnus Olafsson and Harthacnut, the then king of the English and half-brother to Edward the Confessor. William of Normandy's claim to the English throne came from his distant, although firm, familial connection to King Edward. Edward's mother, Queen Emma of Normandy, was the daughter of Richard, the first Duke of Normandy, and great-uncle to William, leading William to then believe that he had the right of succession since Edward died with no heir. Additionally, Edward, until his accession to the throne, following the death of his half-brother Harthacnut in 1041, had been exiled in Normandy for almost 20 years, and after a frankly far too involved discussion on why he fell out with the House of Godwin, Edward and William met in 1051, where Edward, so says William, promised him the throne instead of Harold. To double down on his claim to England, William also argued that Harold, when in France in 1064, had sworn loyalty to him and agreed to promote his claim to the throne. Harold, for his part, tells a story to the contrary. Harold says that he was captured by Guy, the Count of Ponthieu, and passed to William as a hostage, and therefore as a hostage any agreements made between Harold and William were null and void. So on his eventual release, Harold, via the consensus of the Witan, could then dismiss William's claims. Yet to further muddy the waters, 4 months after Harold was crowned, his brother Tostig, who had been exiled to Flanders by King Edward, on the advice of Harold, landed a force on the Isle of Wight in the May of 1066. After seizing as much money and provisions as they could, Tostig's army was then forced into retreat by Harold. However, Tostig was not so easily put down and proceeded to mount sea raids along the Norfolk and Lincolnshire coasts. Eventually, though, Tostig was resisted by Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and his brother Morcar, Earl of Northumbria, and so then fled to the court of King Malcolm III of Scotland. Once in Scotland, Tostig communicated with Harold Hardrada and convinced him to invade England. Not needing much convincing and deciding that this was a good idea, Harold, the King of Norway, set sail for England and was sighted off the coast of what is now Yorkshire on or about the 9th of September. A week later, the Norwegian force, aided by Tostig, made its way up the Humber estuary and onto the River Ouse, meeting the forces of Edwin and Morcar south of York at Fulford. Edwin and Morcar's army were no match for the Norwegian invaders, and the Earls were soundly defeated, leaving the way open for Tostig and Hardrada to capture the city of York. Meanwhile, King Harold Godwinson, who was stationed on the Isle of Wight, waiting for the potential Norman invasion, received word of the events around York and swiftly moved his army north, where he met the Norwegian force at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September. The battle proved decisive in favour of Godwinson, although his victory came at the cost of around a third of his 15,000-strong army. No doubt pleased that he had defended his country against the Norwegians, and assuming that the autumn gales would put pay to any invasion from Normandy, Harold considered his reign secure, at least until the following year's campaigning season. However, Harold was to have no such luck, and word arrived a few days after the battle that the forces of William of Normandy had landed in England and had taken Pevensey Castle on the south coast. Knowing that he had to act fast before the Normans could advance further inland, Harold moved the remains of his army south to meet William. And although Harold managed to recruit men to his army as he travelled through the country, the numbers were not sufficient to replace his losses from Stamford Bridge. The armies of Harold and William first set eyes on one another on the 13th of October, the evening before the battle, with Harold's army taking position on a hill to the north and the Normans on a hill to the south, with marshy terrain separating the two armies. No doubt both hoped that the other would advance on their position and so be caught in the wet ground. But as it was, the Normans took the surprising move of advancing from their hill and positioning themselves below the Saxons. Usually for this time, battles were often quick affairs, mostly being concluded in a couple of hours. However, the resolute stance of the Saxons on the hills stretched the battle out for most of the day, and it was not until dusk that the Norman army finally broke down the English defence and William of Normandy could claim England for his own.